Glad that you've chosen to spend an hour or so here with us. We don't do this very often, but my wife is named Janet, and she works in the chemistry department at William Mary. In fact, she had Dr. Coleman as a professor, evidently, early on. And so word came out that Dr. Coleman was delivering a lecture that would be broadcast. Janet works at home now. And so she said, why don't you watch this with me, because it's called the Science Behind Dementia. I don't know what my wife was telling me exactly, but that's fine. So we watched it together, and I was enthralled. I was enthralled by the content. I was enthralled by the presentation, and with the immense knowledge. I never had you at William Mary because I avoided any class that I wasn't sure I was going to pass. So when I saw the lecture, I thought to myself, I want everyone to see it, because it's about dementia and the science behind dementia, but it's also about things that we can do to encourage people who have dementia and to maybe mitigate the development of that, and for us, the ways that we can learn how to take care of ourselves for brain health. And I was so overwhelmed with it that I thought that I would invite and Dr. Coleman. He was willing to come and deliver that same lecture for us. And I'm sure that you will enjoy it. I'm sure that you will get a lot out of it. I have a song I want to sing, and we have encountered each other not just through Janet, but because April's mom was at the nursing home, and Gratitude would sing, and she was always there listening, and I enjoyed that a great deal. So I thought, well, I wanted to sing a song the kind of songs that we would sing when we were at nursing home. And you might know it, and if you know it, sing with me. If not, I'll just sing it to you. This is a precious song to me. It's called Precious Memories. Precious memories, unseen angels, sent from somewhere to my soul. How they linger ever near me, and the sacred unfold. Precious memories, how they linger, and how they ever flood my soul. In the stillness of the midnight, precious sacred scenes unfold. Precious Father, loving Mother, fly across the lonely year, and old home scenes of my childhood in fond memory appear. Precious memories, and how they linger, and how they ever flood my soul. In the stillness of the midnight, precious sacred scenes unfold. I'd like to ask you to bow your heads. Let me have a prayer. Lord, we praise you for the precious memories that we have. We praise you for the people who have told us the good news of our salvation, the people who have introduced us to the one who is salvation for us. So tonight, as we gather here and we listen to issues of the science behind dementia, make us mindful of those people where it's not just a science project, but it's a disease that robs people of sacred things in their life. Bless us as we listen and we learn. And I pray a special prayer for Dr. Coleman as he speaks. Wrap him in your arms. And we make our prayer in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor. Before I begin, I just want to say a few things by way of introduction. I was introduced to Pastor and Janet through my mother-in-law, who was at the consulate for a number of years, and the delightful group from your church would come once a month, and I'd always have to circle on the monthly calendar the Sunday that your gang was going to be there, because she just loved Pastor's guitar playing and Janet's scripture reading and everything about what happened there. And you're going to see from the talk here that I'm giving you this evening that music can play an important part in dementia. We seem to have a different place in our brains to store music. And when musical groups would come to the consulate and play music, the residents there would just light up and be able to sing along. Even if they didn't remember that they took their medicine 2 hours ago, it didn't matter. They could sing songs that they remembered 20 years ago and just join right in. So in a sense, when Pastor asked me to come and present this talk to the congregation, to the folks who are gathered here in the sanctuary, and also to those who might be tuning in on the live stream, I just want to say thank you as a church for all that you're doing in the community. It really means a lot to April and I know it means a lot to the residents in the consulate, because I got to know a number of them quite well over the years, and it's quite an impact that your traveling group is able to do. Furthermore, I just have to say, you'll get used to my sense of humor as we go along here. I couldn't say no to a gentleman whose email address is holyroller1. Okay? I mean, how can you refuse someone who's willing to have a moniker like that? It just tells me a lot about the pastor. And I think I also should tell you that after the service, I'd come and visit my mother-in-law, and I'd say, "How was it?" And she'd say, "That delightful man with the white beard and the guitar just was wonderful." She never could remember his name, but the white beard and the guitar really stood out for her. So what I have here is really a general lecture, as Pastor suggested, that I want to give you a feel for the science that is behind dementia, and then talk a little bit about what we can do to help ourselves. The talk doesn't get real technical, and I'm just going to gloss over that. I don't want you to tune me out if you see something up here that you don't understand. Please stick with me, okay? And with that said, we'll go through it here. So, what is dementia? And you can see from the image at the top here, we have a caregiver giving a hug probably to her husband, who maybe is slowly tuning out from the real world. Who knows? And then I like the forget-me-not as an idea to go along with this slide. So, just very quickly, some symptoms of dementia. I'll read these because I came out here on Thursday to do a little rehearsal, and I saw that my font size wasn't the greatest for the sanctuary, so I tried gearing it up a little bit. But, you know, there are several areas to look at here cognitively, or thinking. You know, we lose memory, we have mental decline, confusion sets in, disorientation, maybe an inability to speak or understand, things like that, an inability to recognize common things. From a behavioral point of view, irritability, maybe personality changes. You suddenly don't know this person you're living with, and you wonder what's going on. Mood changes, anxiety, loneliness, things like that. Psychologically, depression, hallucinations, maybe even paranoia. Muscular inability to combine muscle movements or unsteady walking is a potential symptom. And that kind of goes along with falling and jumbled speech. Being able to speak really requires a lot of activity in the brain, and controlling the muscles for your speech is really difficult, so you might have problems like that. So what is dementia? If we look at Alzheimer's Association definition for dementia, it's an umbrella term that refers to a general loss of abilities involving memory and judgment, language and abstract thinking, as well as changes in personality. So this is just kind of a concise thing here from the Alzheimer's group. So it's an umbrella term that really covers a lot of territory. And if we look under that umbrella of dementia, whoops, I'm messing things up here. I told the person in the control booth that I knew how to use this thing. Bear with me as I continue to learn. We're going to get out of kindergarten here in a minute and move along. The big one under the umbrella, which you probably are thinking about, is Alzheimer's disease. But there are a lot of others. Parkinson's, real problem. Frontal temporal dementia. Lewy body, which kind of goes along with Parkinson's. Multiple sclerosis. But then I'd like to point out some things that can lead to dementia. It can be alcohol related. It can be drug related. A genetic condition, yes. There are some families that have a genetic disposition for certain forms of dementia. So yeah, we have to look at our genetic heritage to some extent. But disease and infection related. Now, my research at William & Mary, which you'll see right at the end, is neurodegenerative disease research as my major area. And we're looking at COVID-19, and you've seen in the news that COVID can lead to problems with cognition, can lead to problems with taste and smell and things like this, which are getting back into the brain, looking at our senses that God gave us, the 7 senses that tune in the outside world, if you will. So I'm interested in that. And then some infections, viral infections. There seems to be a clear connection between viral infections and, for example, multiple sclerosis. Herpes simplex virus, which is the virus behind cold sores that you might know about. There seems to be a connection between it and some of these dementias also. So the viruses can mess up our brain function to a significant degree, and we have to be careful as we can be, avoiding them as we're trying to do with COVID, because COVID seems to be so much more dangerous than the flu virus or the herpes virus or some others, so we have to be careful there. Looking at a pie chart, you can see that Alzheimer's disease is the major disease if we look globally at dementias, followed by cerebrovascular disease. So our blood flow to the brain, if it gets messed up, is going to lead to a real problem. Again, the science behind dementia, you're going to see what I'm talking about there. Lewy body disease, you probably never heard of that. Lewy bodies are little particles that form in the brain when a protein doesn't fold properly, and it's usually associated with Parkinson's disease, but it can be a disease all by itself. And frontotemporal dementia, I have a young lady who said she was studying Parkinson's, and then she wanted to switch and look at frontotemporal dementia, and she said to me, "Professor Coleman, is it all right if I start studying FTD?" Okay. And I thought, what does that have to do with flower deliveries? So we got that straightened out. She was talking about a different kind of FTD instead of what I was thinking of. She was talking about frontotemporal dementia, and she's looking at it right now. If we look at the dementias and look at the arrows, don't worry about the fine print. I just want you to see that there are so many different regions of the brain that can lead to a demented state. And depending on the region that is being affected, we have all these different diseases. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease, comes about from a loss of some motor control, especially with your diaphragm and breathing. Huntington's disease, a really weird disease that has all kinds of unusual symptoms. Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are the most common, I think, for us to know about. And they're the ones where you find most of the research dollars going as well, because so many more individuals are suffering from those two dementias than any others. Now, if we look at the increase in dementia, going all the way back to 1980 and now up to 2025, you can see from 1980 to 2000, in that 20-year span, we essentially doubled the number of millions of people who are affected by dementia of some kind. And projections for 2025 were almost doubling again. So what's going on? And one of the answers is, if we look at how we are aging, as a population, we seem to be living longer. Okay, now the analogy that I like to use there, and I don't think there are too many in the room that can go back and think about the 1930s and the Social Security Administration that was set up by FDR. But in the mid to late 1930s, when Social Security came on board, the average lifespan for both men and women was late 50s. Okay? Now those sneaky government officials, where did they set the retirement age? 65. Okay, so not too many people were living to retirement in those days. They were dying before they had a chance to retire. Okay, well, we've caught up to that. And now, who knows when our children and grandchildren are going to be able to retire and collect Social Security. They might not allow them to retire because we're living longer. But my point is, as we age, the prevalence of dementia increases. It seems to go along with age because we lose certain abilities as we age, and we need to try to fight off what it is we're losing, which will be toward the end of my talk here, as Pastor suggested. So this is not a good curve here. This is almost like an exponential curve where it's just increasing rather rapidly, and we have to be careful about that. But you know, probably in this congregation, you have some really elderly people, maybe even some centenarians of 100 or longer. When I was visiting April's mother in the consulate, we had a few people that were celebrating their 100th birthday or 101 or whatever. We are living longer, but not necessarily better. So is dementia inherited? Generally not. Huntington's disease is one of the few that has a significant genetic component to it. But in general, no, that's not the case. So grandma doesn't pass along to daughter who passes it along to her child. That's not too common. There are some instances in all of the dementias. You can sometimes find a genetic connection, but not usually. So what's happening? What's going on with dementia? Well, if we think about aging and what's happening to your brain, this image kind of serves pretty nicely. Instead of changing seasons, we're actually looking at getting older and losing some of the neurons in our brain. Or we can think of, the thinking part of our brain is getting erased. Kind of a nasty way to think about it. But if we look at a healthy brain, a cross-section of a healthy brain, compared to someone who suffered really severe Alzheimer's disease, you can see how the brain cells have just kind of faded away. They're not there anymore. And this would be an individual who probably couldn't communicate with the world any longer to get a brain at that level. So we have different regions of the brain. The thinking part of the brain up here in the top and the front is the cortex part, the cerebral cortex. That's where we're doing a lot of thinking. Kind of buried in the middle of the brain is the limbic system, which is the seat of emotion. Now, one of the classes I teach at William & Mary is a very popular freshman class on the chemistry of emotion and behavior. Students love to take that class, so much so that I have to offer it every semester for them. It's a relatively small class, but we get into a lot of good discussions about behaviors and emotions, and they learn a lot about the brain and the limbic system kind of buried right in the middle of the brain, which is sort of the seat of emotional behavior, fears and love and all that. Not so much the instinctive brain, reptilian brain, if you will. This old brain has just basic functions, like you don't have to think about your digestive system working. You don't have to tell yourself to breathe. You don't have to tell yourself your heart to pump. All that's being taken care of down here. So you don't have to worry about that. You can spend your time with other things going on in your life. Okay, so I'm going to show you some brain facts here. Don't panic, please. All right? Some brain facts. Our brain is about 3 pounds, 46 to 50 ounces. It contains roughly 100 billion neurons. A neuron might have 1,000 to 10,000 connections to other neurons. Those connections are called synapses, and I'll show you that in a minute. So it's communicating with maybe 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons or muscle cells or glands or whatever. So we might have 100 trillion synaptic connections in the brain. Oops. Okay, so here is a motor neuron. What's a motor neuron? Well, it's a neuron that's controlling my finger when I'm doing this. My brain is sending a signal telling the muscles to do this. So this neuron here is picking up information from other neurons. That's what this structure is. This is the receiving end of a neuron. And it's going to make a decision because some of the information it's getting is positive and some of it is negative. Or some of it excites the neuron, some of it turns off the neuron. So the neuron is actually just a simple machine that is going to make a decision. When I gather all this information, does the positive outweigh the negative? If the positive outweighs the negative, it's going to fire a charge down this axon and do whatever it's supposed to do at the end of that axon. Well, in this case, it's a motor neuron, so the neuron is communicating directly with a muscle fiber, telling that muscle to contract or relax or do whatever. So that's one kind of neuron, a motor neuron. Okay? Notice the sheath on here. Nature has managed to put kind of an insulating sheath on the axon, that long thing, and the insulating sheath makes it more efficient. It doesn't have to spend as much energy. The brain is really energy intensive. It doesn't have to spend as much energy to send the impulse down this axon and fire or contract that neuron. Now, the myelin sheath for a motor neuron is something that deteriorates in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, leading to an inability to coordinate your muscle movement, and you can't breathe so well. So unfortunately, individuals suffering Lou Gehrig's disease have a very sad death awaiting for them if we can't control the disease, because eventually their peripheral muscles are going to be paralyzed. Their brain is perfectly fine. They're thinking about what's going on around them, but they can't control anything. Okay, and they end up dying, usually from a secondary infection like pneumonia or something else. So it's really very, very sad. Now, the other kind of neuron that we have lots of in our brains are called interneurons. They're neurons that communicate with other neurons. So here is a previous neuron that's communicating through synaptic connections to this neuron. It's going to fire an impulse down its axon and interact with other neurons in the brain. So this is called an interneuron. And it also has a coating, that myelin sheath on it. And when that deteriorates in our brains, we tend to get things like multiple sclerosis and so on, as the myelin sheath disintegrates in the brain. So this is the most common of the neurons here. Okay, so we store enormous amounts of information in our brain, more than we realize. In everyday speech, we may only use 1,000 to 2,000 words. Someone who does a lot of talking, me, preacher, others maybe have a slightly larger vocabulary to do all the things that we need to do. But typically, we're not using very many of the words that we've learned over a lifetime of learning. We might recognize 20 to 50,000 words. Okay, so the brain has 10 to the 11th power. That's 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, 11 times. It's a big number, okay? And each of those neurons has 10,000 synaptic connections. So we're getting a total of 10 to the 15 synaptic connections. Now, that's scientific notation. 10 times 10 times 10, 15 times. It doesn't mean anything. It's a nice way for scientists to show a number that our minds can kind of comprehend. But let me give you an analogy of what 10 to the 15th power means. You know what a ping pong ball looks like, okay? So if we have 10 to the 15th power ping pong balls, we can think of a ping pong ball as maybe 1 inch on a side if we could turn it into a cube, okay? And we have 10 to the 15 of those. Now, do you have any idea, and I know you don't, because I'm playing mind games with you. You have any idea how many 10 to the 15th power ping pong balls might give you? Do you think it's enough to cover the floor area of this church? And you better say yes. Do you think it's enough to cover Williamsburg? And you better say yes. How about enough to cover Virginia? And you better say yes. Because 10 to the 15th 1-inch cubes, if we lay them out puzzle-like, are a sufficient number to cover the continental United States and Canada. Okay, that's 10 to the 15th power. Now, we have that many synaptic connections in our brain, okay, to do what we need to do. And we have reserve capacity there because the brain is actually losing neurons on a daily basis. And that's nothing to worry about because we have quite an excess supply of neurons. So it's okay, right? Now, here are the whole set of players in the brain. We have neurons communicating with other neurons. We have a special kind of cell that makes that insulating coating. They're called oligodendrocytes, and they're the ones that make myelin sheaths, and they make myelin sheaths for a lot of neurons all around them. Then we have these guys called astrocytes. They're really important because they're the cells in the brain that actually pick up the sugar in your bloodstream, convert it into a usable form for the neuron, and give it to the neuron to do what it needs to do. So the astrocytes are kind of the supporting players in the movie here that we're talking about. And then these little nasty looking guys back here are the microglia. That's actually your brain's immune system. Now, we're learning a lot about the immune system with COVID, but the immune system that COVID is dealing with is our peripheral immune system. And there's something called the blood-brain barrier that doesn't allow very many things in your blood to get into your brain, including your immune cells. So your brain takes care of that with these microglia to serve as the brain's immune system. And they'll come and clean up debris, take care of inflammation, things like that. A little more science here. There are three main areas in a neuron that are really important. Of major importance are things called the mitochondria. That's something inside the neuron that's responsible for making most of the energy that the cell requires. So it's an important component of a neuron. The Golgi apparatus is in charge of taking materials and seeing that they get to the right location. So you can think of it as the U.S. Postal Service, or if you've had bad experiences with the U.S. Postal Service, maybe you want to think about it in terms of FedEx or UPS, and maybe that would be better for you to think about it like that. But the Golgi apparatus can take something that's being built, that has been built, and transfer it to the correct location in the cell, or even send it outside the cell for some use. So when it starts falling apart, that's not so good. And the other thing is the rough endoplasmic reticulum, big fancy word. It's the location in the cell where proteins are being made. And proteins are at the heart of everything that happens inside the cell. They really are very important. So I've highlighted those 3 areas in green because they can fall apart, deteriorate, and lead to a stressed out neuron, and ultimately a neuron that dies. And that's what we're worried about here with dementia. Okay, your brain uses 20% of the total oxygen in your body. So we're breathing oxygen all the time. We're actually breathing nitrogen and oxygen. The atmosphere here on Earth right now is about 80% nitrogen, 20% oxygen. But that's what the oxygen is what we need for energy. So what's going on there? We'll come back to our mitochondria, and I just want to touch on this a little bit. Bear with me, okay? Because it's kind of important for what we're thinking about later on. So here's a mitochondrion, and inside it has 2 membranes, kind of a smooth outer one and then a really articulated inner one. And embedded in this inner one is something called the electron transport system. So we're moving electrons from one complex to another as we go along here. And at the end of that movement, here is the oxygen that's picking up the electrons and getting reduced to water. So when we're breathing oxygen, it's ultimately going to be used to get converted to water. It's going to get reduced. Okay, when that happens, we're pumping a lot of protons. It takes energy to pump the protons, and then we're going to take that proton gradient, is what it is, and send it through something called an ATP synthase machine. And it's a beautiful construction of nature. You know, the more I learn about biochemistry, the more I appreciate the God who we all worship in a sanctuary like this, because everything is just so fascinating and put together in an interesting way. And you might not hear too many scientists who are willing to say that, but I am a Christian, and I don't mind saying the things that I say about our Creator and some of the beautiful things that we can look at down at the molecular level and have an appreciation. But this thing right here kind of spins around almost like an engine, and it's making an energy molecule called ATP. ATP is the energy that the cell needs to do its thing. Okay, if your neurons start getting overworked, the mitochondria have to keep making more and more energy. And when they do that, some of these complexes end up losing the electrons. It isn't perfect. They end up losing the electrons. And the electrons can go to oxygen and start making bad things called reactive oxygen species. One is this superoxide anion. You're familiar with hydrogen peroxide. That's this guy here, H2O2. You probably have it in your medicine cabinet. Okay, put it on a cut or something and watch it foam up. That's always fun to entertain children. If they come in crying with a cut, you pour some on them and they go, whoa, look at that. You say, yes, we're taking care of the bad bugs there. So hydrogen peroxide, and then that can be turned into something really nasty called the hydroxy anion. And that's a really bad guy that can start doing bad things to DNA, doing bad things to cell membranes, doing bad things to a lot of things. So I want you to remember nothing more than neurons that are getting overworked end up losing electrons and making reactive oxygen species, which are not good things. So we want to keep that in mind. We need to have some way to fight this. Nature has a way to fight it, but it can get out of control. And when it gets out of control, some of the things that you do and eat and so on can make a big difference in what's going to happen inside your brain. So we want to keep that in mind. Okay, so here's a damaged neuron. A damaged neuron. Here's an activated microglial cell, one of those brain immune cells. And we can see genetic factors possibly can contribute to doing this. Brain trauma, if something bad happens to your brain, not necessarily a bullet wound, but an accident where you really whacked it pretty hard and broken some of the brain to some degree, can lead to this. But I want to call your attention up here along the top to things that can lead to pro-inflammatory or inflammation in your brain that's going to lead to all of this. Reduced physical activity or sedentary lifestyle, midlife obesity, sepsis or systemic inflammation, poor oral health or periodontitis. These are some things that can begin to happen as we age if we're not careful. Okay? Reduced physical activity. You slow down, you get arthritis in your joints, you can't move as fast, and suddenly you're not able to maintain a good, healthy body weight necessarily, or whatever. So midlife obesity can catch up to you. And none of that is good. It can lead to damaged neurons. And it's just another view here. The big name I want to call out here is inflammation. So inflammation in your brain is not good. It's going to lead to those microglia, the brain immune cells, trying to overcome inflammation. We get microglial activation here. This cycle here is reactive microgliosis, and we end up either killing or badly damaging a neuron with all kinds of things that can get kicked out from the brain's immune system. And I like to use the analogy, if you've been keeping up with COVID, you know that when you breathe into COVID virus, it tends to attack your lungs. And your immune system will fight that by sending out some chemicals to fight it off. But sometimes we have such a strong immune response that our immune system begins attacking our lungs, and we end up really seriously damaging the lungs. You've read in the newspapers about some individuals needing double lung transplants as a result of COVID infection. So this is on a little different scale, but if the brain's immune system gets carried away, it can end up damaging and harming the neurons. And another view here. And what I really want to call your attention to here is the bloodstream here. Here's the blood-brain barrier. Here's the brain. Here's a young and healthy neuron, a healthy microglial cell. And as we age, the blood-brain barrier starts breaking down and things start leaking into our brain that aren't so good for the brain. And we can see the good microglia is becoming a senescent microglia and an old microglia that doesn't work so well anymore. And ultimately, the neurons will end up dying off, largely as a result of a breakdown in the blood-brain barrier and a not so healthy lifestyle, really. So that's kind of the end of the science lecture. Okay. Now, what do you think this is? Okay, I would have said an MRI also, but it isn't. Okay, an MRI is capable of taking a structural picture of your brain, but it just looks at structure. This is actually a PET scan machine. PET stands for positron emission tomography. Yay, big fancy name. What it does is analyze the activity of your brain. So this is a really interesting instrument because it actually is looking at your brain at work, as opposed to an MRI, which just has a static picture of the structure of your brain, or the structure of whatever MRI you're dealing with. So MRIs are good for structure. PET scanners are good for actually looking at things that are active and working. So you go into one of these just like you would in an MRI, and here's what we get. Regions of the brain that are really active show up in red, okay, just from the way the computer is set up to show you where the active things are. So here's a normal brain, different cross sections, like close to the top of the brain and then deeper into the brain. Here's someone who's suffering early Alzheimer's. Here's someone who's suffering late Alzheimer's. And here's a small child. And what I want you to see is, we don't see a lot of activity in a small child in their brain, depending on how young they were. And you can think about this from an adult's point of view, slowly fading away with Alzheimer's, for example. What's happening to their brain? It's beginning to look more and more like a child's brain because it's not working. The neurons aren't working anymore. So we get to see that kind of imagery in a PET scanner, and it's really very, very useful to look at what's going on in the brain. Okay, so is there any hope for our brains? We could put them on IV fluids maybe. My wife is sitting down front here with a purple shirt on. I see a young man here with purple on. But if she had a choice, she'd take the purple IV over here compared to the other IVs. I'm picking on you, dear. Or what if our brains were like Teslas? We just plug them in at night and let them recharge overnight and they're ready to go in the morning. That'd be interesting too, wouldn't it? Okay, well, we're going to come close to that before I'm finished here because we'll talk about sleep and what's going on there. It's not quite the same as plugging your brain in now. So, one of the things we see from research is that an enriched environment promotes brain development. What I want you to take away from all these words here, this was done at UC Berkeley some time ago. Some rats were put in a deprived environment, kind of an isolation block, if you will, and others were in a cage that had lots of toys and buddies to hang out and play with and things like that. So that's an enriched environment. And what was found is the rats in the enriched environment had thicker cortices for thinking, more synaptic contacts, and the end result was they kind of proved that the brain isn't static. And I want you to know that your brain is not static. If you use it in the right way, it's going to adapt to what you're asking it to do, and it's going to grow and flourish and make new connections and grow new neurons and all of that. So there was a myth that the number of brain cells you had at birth is that's all you're getting. No, that's not true. The brain can replenish itself. We see some individuals over a long therapy time recovering from pretty serious gunshot wounds or automobile accidents where they regain a lot of their former self, if you want to think about it, that motor control and speech and so on. So it's not static. It's plastic. The word is plastic, the plastic brain, just meaning it's adaptable, malleable like a piece of plastic, not hard like steel. Okay? So here's what happened. This poor rat here in the impoverished environment, we look at its cortical neurons, and they're not very good. We look at the cortical neurons from rats that were in an enriched environment, and we see they are much more robust. They've made a lot of other connections to other neurons, things like that. So an enriched environment, keep that in mind, is really important for our brains. So enriched environments will increase the number of synaptic connections. They grow new trees, make new connections. Increase neural density, you make more neurons, period. Neural sprouting, that's the connections that are being made. You slow down cell death. You increase spatial learning. One of the things that happens with Alzheimer's or dementia is you tend to lose spatial orientation. My mother suffered dementia, and toward the end of her freedom time before we had to put her into an assisted living facility, she would drive to the supermarket or to a shopping center and go in and do whatever she was doing. She'd come out to her car and get in her car and not know how to get home. She was losing a spatial ability, among other things. So that's one of the potential signs of dementia that we have to worry about. We can even see a regaining of motor skills in an enriched environment. And here is an interesting example of when neurons talk to one another through those synaptic connections, they're sending some chemicals across the the space between the neurons. Those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. So the chemistry of emotion and behavior, we look at these chemicals a lot in my class. What I want you to see is if you repeatedly do that, you're preparing for an exam, so you're learning the material. You keep going over it and over it and over it. Okay, and what's happening? You're strengthening the connection. You're making a memory in your brain by strengthening that connection. So we see more receptors on this side, more chemicals being released on that side, and we have a stronger connection. So that's how memories are formed. We strengthen the connection between the neurons. Okay, now what? Where do we stand? What are the key words that I've given to you so far? I better not do this. I don't want to. I was told by the people in charge of the stage here that I could wander around, but because of COVID, I'm not allowed to step down there, so I'm staying up here. What have we learned? Well, enriched environment, that is what we talked about last. Inflammation is not good. The reactive oxygen species are not good, so we're hoping for some antioxidants in our lifestyle. We want to get some anti-inflammatories. We want a good blood flow to the brain because it needs a lot of energy. So if we can strengthen blood flow to the brain, that's going to be very, very helpful. Okay? So, now what? Well, let's keep our brain healthy. And we're going to look at number 1 here. Eat healthy foods. So let's look at healthy foods. And healthy foods would be colorful foods. Colorful foods are important because the color is coming from pigments that are really good at fighting those reactive oxygen species. They're called antioxidants. So the more colorful your daily menu is, the better it is going to be for your brain to fight those reactive oxygen species. Whole grains are good. See, I'm failing this control here. What can I say? The professor flunked Control 101 here, or whatever. Okay. Lean meats, fish, poultry, low-fat, non-fat dairy products, less solid fat, get away from lard and Crisco and things like that. You don't want to use those things. Okay? Proper portion sizes and adequate fluids, all important. So here's some antioxidant brain fruit. Okay? Whether you like them or not, these are the good guys here. My wife loves, I think, essentially all of these. We have avocados. Pomegranates are good. I love blueberries and cherries. Kiwi we don't eat too much of. Watermelon we don't eat too much of, but, they're there. Nuts and seeds. We have in our house, we have quite a large variety of nuts and seeds that April and I like to munch on. Very, very good. Cherry tomatoes or tomatoes in general. And then carrots. I'm the rabbit in the household here. I love carrots. So these are all antioxidant materials, and your diet ought to have a good portion of them. And of all the diets, I've given this talk to other groups also, but gosh, never in a sanctuary and never with a nice prayer from a pastor before I got started. So this is really special to me, and I appreciate the opportunity. But other people have said, well, what should we eat? If there's a diet you want to follow, a good diet to follow would be the Mediterranean diet, which has lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and beans and legumes and so on as the main part of the meal. Maybe fish and seafood less often. Moderate portions of poultry, eggs, cheese, and yogurt, and then even less often, red meats and sweets. So unfortunately, you want to avoid that if you can. In moderation, some wine, if you must. And then every day, lots of water. You want to keep yourself well hydrated. really important. And then every day be physically active, enjoy meals with others, and so on. So that all goes together in a nice, concise package. Foods that fight inflammation. We're trying to avoid inflammation. So we want tomatoes and leafy greens, spinach, kale, and collards. I must admit, my wife and I grew up north of the Mason-Dixon line. So we're just a bunch of Yankees. No matter how long we live here, we're never going to be Southerners. Okay, so I'm still dealing with collard greens. I love kale, and I love spinach. And we actually grew in our garden over winter. We grew some collards for a close friend. I took him 2 bags of collards, and he was in heaven, preacher. First thing he did was open the bag and just take a sniff of the fresh leaves. And then he started talking about mixing in some bacon, a little bit of sugar, and grilling it up, and he was looking forward to the collards. So leafy greens, olive oil is a good oil. Again, the Mediterranean diet, olive groves there in the Mediterranean region. Fatty fish, salmon, mackerel, tuna, sardines, all good. And then nuts and fruits, of course. What you don't want to eat, or not much of it, are things like fried foods, French fries. So if you're addicted to French fries, get unaddicted. Sodas, refined carbs, white bread, not so good. Whole wheat, okay. Saturated fats, no, you don't want that. And then processed meats, heavily processed meats like hot dogs and regular hamburgers, red meat hamburgers. We like to make turkey burgers and use turkey or chicken in place of red meats to do some of these things. But you want to avoid inflammatory foods. They're going to trigger some activity in the gut, and I don't have the connection in this talk, but my research group is looking at the connection between what you eat and the bacteria that are in your gut helping to digest your food. And there's actually a connection between your gut and your brain. So if you're eating good things, you're going to grow good bacteria in your colon, and that's going to give you some chemicals that are going to help your brain relieve anxiety, depression, stress, and things like that. So it's really important to think about what you're eating. Okay, be active and exercise. Okay, exercise can really benefit all of us. And how is it doing it? Well, it affects cognition in the following ways. It's improving blood circulation. It's making oxygen more available to your brain. We just talked about oxygen in your brain. You need a good supply of oxygen, okay? And it clears out the metabolic waste. The brain is a very, very active organ, and it's generating a lot of waste that needs to get flushed away. So the more exercise you do, the better able is your brain to take care of all that waste material. Regular exercise will decrease the symptoms of stress. If we're really experiencing chronic stress, our adrenal gland, which is sitting right on top of our kidneys back here, got to work on my anatomy a little bit, will kick out cortisol. And that's called the stress hormone. And too much cortisol all the time in your body is not good. It's going to lead to bad things, deteriorating health. So we got to watch for that. So exercise improves your mood. It's a good antidepressant. And it increases the growth of neurons, especially in the frontal lobes, your thinking area, and in the hippocampus. That's part of the limbic system in the middle of your brain. It's where your memory is first consolidated. So as you make memories, they kind of pass through the hippocampus, which then sends things up to the thinking part of the brain and stores it as a memory there for you. So exercise will help with all of that. And we should continue exercising with age. One of the things that's very good that we can all do all through our lives is taking a walk. Okay, as simple as taking a walk for a half an hour, 45 minutes, get out and walk. It encourages cognitive focus. You can find something that challenges you, ballroom dancing, I get a chuckle out of the young kids at William & Mary. One of the more popular classes for physical activity is ballroom dancing. So I think of ballroom dancing as like the 30s and 40s with the big band sound and everything. No, and they're busy ballroom dancing in there. So you guys can do that too, maybe, or yoga possibility. But even if you can't do yoga, you can certainly walk, and I encourage you to do that. Be good to your heart. The same risk factors that lead to heart attacks and strokes are in some way associated with the development of dementia. So what does this mean? The lifestyle that you have that will help your heart will also maintain your brain. So I like to think of the brain and the heart as going together. If you're exercising your heart, at the same time you're really exercising your brain and keeping your brain in a healthy state. So they go together. Okay? Exercise is really important. You don't have to, let's not talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger going into the weight room or something crazy like that. Just mild exercise. Keep moving. Don't become a couch potato. Okay? Now I'm standing up here on my soapbox am I sounding like a preacher, Mr. Preacher? I'm preaching here, telling them that they really need to think about these things carefully. I mean, that it's really important. I love giving this talk, and the reason I love giving this talk is I feel like I can provide some knowledge to all of you to at least think about what you should be doing and understand why you should be doing it. Why should I exercise? No, I really have to. Yes, you should exercise. Okay? Okay, learn new things. That kind of goes with the enriched environment. You saw those neurons in the rats that had lots of friends and toys and things like that. So our cognitive abilities can be maintained or improved. I'm emphasizing improved here by exercising the brain. Improves your mental status, less errors in your learning, improved function of daily activity, decreased depression, all those good things. Brain stimulation continued here. Intellectual activity and social interaction. Chatting, being socially interactive with friends in work or outside work, really lights up your brain. When I say lights up your brain, we're looking at those PET scans again and all the red that's lighting up your brain. That's really lighting up your brain. Taking up new hobbies and interests and intellectual challenges. Maybe learning to play a musical instrument. I found this, and I like it because it's emphasizing reading, walking, and gardening. Now, none of you know April and I, but we both like to get out in the yard and garden and do things like that, and we get great pleasure in seeing things grow and maybe harvesting things from the garden, like I just mentioned, collard greens for a friend. So those are all really good. Getting in the soil or the dirt. I have a geology friend. I say, "Oh, you like dirt?" And he said, "No, geologists call it soil." Okay? So it's soil, it's not dirt. All right? Okay. I said, "Sure." When I was a kid, I played in the dirt. I didn't know what soil was. All right. So, playing a musical instrument. I picked the violin here, this image, because it really brings into play a lot of things. You need to think about sound. You need fine motor control to pull the bow across the strings. You need fine motor control for fingering the strings. I appreciate what Pastor Edward does with his guitar. I love listening to him and think about how his brain has been trained to do all the things that need to do. He probably doesn't think about it anymore. It just happens as he plays because he's reached that point where his brain has picked up all those things. And his plastic brain, if we look at the musical area, we're analyzing your brain, Pastor, okay? We look at the area of the brain that deals with music. He's going to have many more neurons and many more connections there than someone who doesn't play an instrument or a guitar. The brain has adapted to his lifestyle, okay? And part of his lifestyle, an important part for him, is his instrument and making music. And we all love him for doing that because it's beautiful to listen to, isn't it? So music is wonderful. Here's the brain's reaction to music. The brain at rest, it's lighting up a little bit. You're conscious, okay? We didn't say you were sleeping or in a coma. You're just resting. But then if you're listening to music, when Pastor plays something like he did in gratitude here before the start of this talk, I think all of our brains were lighting up like you see here, just enjoying what was given to us by him. Okay, be socially involved. So you ought to be doing things with friends. Not what I see too many of this generation doing, looking at phones, iPads, laptops. I get really discouraged in it, William and Mary, when I go through the integrated science building. It has a beautiful atrium area with a Starbucks outlet and lots of tables and chairs for students to sit around and socialize. And invariably, I'll come upon more than one group gathered around a table. There might be 4 or 5 students sitting around a table, and they're not talking to each other. They're looking at their phones or their iPads or whatever. What's going on with that? Oh, well, what are you going to do? So we don't want to see this happening. We want to see this. Here's some volunteers. Get out and volunteer. I think one of the things about a church is there are lots of potential activities for you to get involved in the community or with one another. And these are all good social things that really help your brain. So you ought to think about all of that. And then lastly, here's a group of friends who are celebrating something. And then here are 2 grandparents with grandkids. Now, research shows that grandparents who have the ability to interact with their grandchildren, maybe because they live close by instead of at the other coast of the country, you can look at the research and find that grandparents who can interact with their grandchildren tend to live longer than those who can't interact with their grandchildren. So that's important also. Okay, avoid stress. Are you feeling stress? I hope not right now. Okay, there's the big stress bugaboo. What's going on with stress? Okay, here's some things to think about. Body, headaches, fatigue, emotions, losing confidence, being fussy, irritable, depression, apathy, behavior, smoking possibly, I hope not, restlessness, insomnia, accident prone, mind worrying, muddled thinking, impaired judgment, and so on. Stress can lead to all of that. That cortisol that I talked about coming from the adrenal glands can produce symptoms like this. And we need to be careful about that. You want to calm down. And we talk about this space that we're in right now as a sanctuary. It's really a sanctuary from the outside world, isn't it? A place where we can come to meet our God and relax and listen to good words spoken by the preacher, and that can be really important for you as well. If we look at what's actually physically happening in the brain, a lot of those connections, the dendritic connections, under stress, they start getting retracted. Your brain loses its ability to communicate with other neurons, and neurons lose their ability to communicate with other neurons. You're kind of on the road to dementia as a result of stress. So we don't want to see that happening. I like this one. I use this in my freshman class, the chemistry of emotion and behavior. And I talk about, okay, here's a stressed brain. It's trying to remember what's in these books, but it's not having much luck. And I say, think about the schedule in an academic environment. When do you feel the most stress? And they all say, at final exam time. And I say, when do you need to remember the most facts? Final exam time. How are you going to deal with those two contrasting situations? You need to turn down the stress burner if you want to remember those facts. So, it's easy to say that, but to get them to do it can be a real challenge. And we have a brand new, beautiful facility at William & Mary called the Wellness Center, where students can go in and just relax and meditate and do yoga and whatever. So it's kind of like a sanctuary, if you will, right there on campus. We're a state-supported institution. We can't really have a sanctuary on campus, but we can have a wellness center, okay? So we got to keep religion and state separated there. But the wellness center, if you think about what the students can do there, might be something very similar to what you all do here in the sanctuary. And then I like this, because I'm a nature lover, so is April. We like to go for walks in the woods and go over to the Blue Ridge Parkway and hike around the mountains and whatever when we can. And I came upon this term when I was doing research earlier for this talk about forest bathing, which is a term used in Japan. This is the actual Japanese word, Shinrin Yoku. Those are the Japanese symbols. And what it means is you walk into the woods and suddenly you're in a different environment. You're experiencing different smells, different sounds. You've lost the constant flow of traffic and horns blowing and ambulance sirens going off. And you have an opportunity to just relax and think about yourself. Maybe think about your relationship with God, whatever you're working on there. But just relaxing. And it's really something that we can prove as scientists if we look at the kinds of hormones that are in your bloodstream before entering the woods. Within 15 minutes of walking into the woods, we see a change in your hormone composition, we see a lowering of your blood pressure, and we see a lowering of your heart rate. All of those are good things to happen. So just being able to experience the woods is wonderful. Now, this image could very well have been taken at one of the waterfalls over off the Blue Ridge Parkway, because there are a number of nice locations. If you get a map of the Blue Ridge Parkway, they can show you what exits or parking areas to go to and take a hike, and you can find things like this right here in the state of Virginia. And it would be wonderful if you could just go and relax, spend a half an hour listening to the water, listening to the birds chirp, watching the butterflies fly around, smelling the forest around you. Think about that. And recognize that all of that is going to be helpful to your brain. Or if you can't get over to the Blue Ridge, you could sit in your backyard. Okay? If your backyard looked like that. When I look at this, this is not me in April here, but it sure would be nice to have an area like that where we could just sit and listen to the bees buzz on the flower, see the butterflies flying around from flower to flower, and just relax and talk to one another in an environment like that. And that will take a lot of the stress away for you. And then finally, get a good night's sleep. So let's talk about sleep. I've got a lot of words here. I'll just highlight a couple of things. The best way to think about good sleep is to think about what happens if you don't get a good night's sleep. Okay? Your cardiovascular system, you end up with an increase in heart disease. You get an increase in blood pressure. You increase your risk for heart attacks and strokes. If you get 5 or fewer hours of sleep a night, you're going to increase your risk of heart attacks and strokes by 45%. So you should not be getting 5 or fewer hours. That's the cardiovascular system. Your endocrine system will affect your appetite if you don't get enough sleep. Diabetes and impaired glucose tolerance, 2.5 times greater with 5 or fewer hours of sleep, 1.7 times greater with 6 or fewer hours of sleep. Obesity and weight management, increased stress hormones, thyroid and growth hormones are affected. These are all part of your hormonal system, the endocrine system. And then the immune system is more susceptible to illness. You probably have heard, since we've been in COVID here, about sleep and how important it is to keep your immune system healthy. So some of the things I'm telling you here about a good diet and now good sleep is going to help your immune system be robust. All those fruits and vegetables are going to help your immune system. You want to keep your immune system strong to fight off whatever disease comes your way. Nervous system. Memory and learning is affected. We see balance is affected. 2 to 4.5 times greater chance of falling with a poor night's sleep. Mental health, a decreased neurotransmitters affecting mood, more distress, irritability, depression, alcohol use, suicide, decreased quality of life. All of that happens. It's like life is falling apart if you don't get enough sleep. Early death, 6 hours of sleep or less per night, 13 to 30% greater risk of dying regardless of the cause of death. So all those protective factors, if you've been avoiding tobacco, avoiding alcohol, avoiding unhealthy foods, you can just throw all that out the window if you're not getting enough sleep, because you're just harming yourself by not getting enough sleep. So good sleep habits. De-stress, learn some relaxation techniques, both physical and mental. Maintain regular physical activity. We saw that physical activity helped with stress. Fitness reportedly helps with sleep quality also. If you get yourself a reasonable workout during the day, meaning maybe a nice long walk. I'm not talking about, lifting dumbbells and barbells and push-ups and sit-ups, although, if you can do them, they're nice. There is nothing out of reach for anyone in this room. Anyone in this room, I think, can be physically active enough to stave off these problems. Just a matter of getting up and moving. Don't go to bed hungry or full. A light snack, carbs or foods with tryptophan. That's the sleep inducer there. That's a kind of a joke at Thanksgiving time, because turkey has a lot of tryptophan in it. So you eat a big turkey meal at Thanksgiving, and then what do? You go sit in a corner and fall asleep, right? Okay. What's happening to your body during sleep? I'm going to come back to your brain in a minute here. Your heart rate is going to go down. Your blood pressure is going to go down. Your lungs are going to slow down. Your breathing is slowing down, so you're giving your lungs a rest. Your muscles are going to get regenerated. A growth hormone is kicked out during sleep. The muscles that you've torn down by exercise are going to get rebuilt, and that's a good thing. It's okay to tear down your muscles. The more you work them, the more they're going to get torn down and built up. But here's nature's secret. When they get built up stronger. Okay? So exercise gives you a stronger muscular system. And then your stomach, your digestion does slow down, so you don't want to eat a big meal. I can remember when I was a pretty young, 10 maybe, for some crazy reason, I ended up eating almost a whole pizza before I went to bed. Okay? And I can still remember the next morning, my mom said to me, "How'd you sleep last night?" And I said, "I hardly slept at all. I don't know what happened." And she just laughed and said, "It was that pizza you ate right when you went to bed. You shouldn't have done that." Okay, coming back to the brain and what's going on during sleep. One of the things that happens during sleep is the spaces in your brain start opening up a little bit, and cerebrospinal fluid can flow through and flush out the waste that was generated during the day. So it's time to take out the garbage, if you will, while you're sleeping. So we see increased flow, clearing metabolic waste. Here's an artery, here's a vein, and the flow goes from the arteries to the veins, clearing out the bad things and sending them off out of the brain. So we're flushing our brains with a good night's sleep. So your brain's cleanup crew only works the night shift, and you got to give it a chance to work the night shift. So give it enough nighttime hours, if you will. Okay? And that's the summary for the healthy brain. If you've been paying attention, you get your certificate on the way out the door, as long as you promise to get a good night's sleep tonight and eat some good antioxidant foods tomorrow. Okay? Some delicious collard greens. I still haven't tried them, but someday maybe. So think about what I've mentioned here. Okay? And then I'd like to show you a couple of slides from the college. I tend to have a pretty large research group. This is, I'm showing you two different ones. This one here, I happen to have two of my grandchildren. They're not part of the research team. but they happen to be present. My wife and I, at the start of a semester, this is pre-COVID, of course. You don't see any masks there. But we like to give at the start of the semester, since I have a big group, we sponsor a time to provide some food for the research group. And then they get organized into pods of students that are looking at Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and so on. So we have a nice social time together before the start of the semester. So this is one of my groups from one year. This is another one of my groups from another year. I typically have about 20 to 25 students working with me. And a lot of the facts behind the scene that I presented to you this evening have come from these hardworking students at William & Mary, doing research with me and reading all of the journal articles and the real research that's going on, and thinking about all of that. I've also gotten a lot of nice funding over the years. A colleague down at Eastern Virginia Medical School and I got a nice grant from the Commonwealth Health Research Board that sponsored us for a couple of years. That was really kind of icing on the cake. The Commonwealth Health Research Board got its big pot of gold from the cigarette industry, settling a suit that the state brought with the cigarette industry. And the cigarette industry, Philip Morris and others, gave a huge pile of money to the state and said, use this to sponsor health care research in the state of Virginia. Well, that mostly meant cancer. So my colleague and I were happy when we got a grant that included Alzheimer's disease, because we made the case to this Commonwealth Health Research Board that Alzheimer's disease in the state of Virginia was increasing dramatically, and a lot of money was being spent by the state fighting off Alzheimer's. So it was nice to get that money. But over the years, these are some of the grants that I've earned. And that's the end. Thank you for being a patient audience. And you may ask me hard questions if you wish. And then I always end my talks with this next slide, because I grew up with Looney Tunes in the movie theater, and it always ended like that. So that's the end of my talk, and thank you for your attention. Thank you. And I will be happy to answer, or try to answer, any of your questions, if you have some questions.
This is your question, Melanie? Okay. Melanie and Heinz. Does speaking a number of different languages affect the brain, and how?
Say the beginning of it again?
Does speaking a number of different languages affect the brain?
Yes. In fact, the current freshman class that I have right now, I have, I think, 5 people out of the 18 people who speak a second language, and they were very interested in looking at the research behind that, and there seems to be a neuroprotective effect present in the brains of individuals who can speak more than one language. So if you can speak more than one language, that's a good thing for your brain.
Yeah. Melanie, was that your question? Yeah. Okay, and then Heinz has a question. Do all the waves, electricity, microwaves, Wi-Fi, etc., that we're exposed to influence our brain functioning?
Doesn't appear to be the case from all the research that's been done, although there's some instances of some illnesses, not so much brain illnesses, but illnesses showing up for individuals who've been living close to high power lines, things like that. Now, microwaves are dangerous to us. That's why your microwave oven is so well shielded. You know, you don't want to expose your body to microwaves if you can avoid it. And we generally don't have that kind of problem in the environment we're in. There's a lot of studies still going on, frankly, because of the growth of technology and technology devices, the Wi-Fi signals we have in our houses and so on, constant exposure to those. I think the advice is, when you have a phone like I have, you don't have it up to your ear all the time. You might want to hold it away a little bit. So there isn't any hard evidence to this point about the effect that the electromagnetic waves that we're experiencing in the world are unduly affecting our mental ability.
This question says, how does sugar versus sugar-free alternatives affect the brain? Is there a difference, I guess, between when we drink a drink that has sugar for sweetener and...
Part of the problem, the sugar-free drinks, you're kind of fooling your brain a little bit. So your brain is actually telling your body to gear up to do some things metabolically that it ends up not having to do because the sugar isn't there, and that isn't always a good thing.
Okay.
So there's some outcomes with sugar-free drinks that are not so good. Now the sugar, we should try to avoid. If you remember that Mediterranean pyramid, all the way at the top where you have a little bit of some sugar in meats, okay, we don't want to have a lot of sugar intake. It isn't necessary. That the sugar that you want in your blood is glucose, and that's not the table sugar, the cane sugar that you might be putting on your cereal or in your coffee or whatever. We don't need that. The sugar that you need really can just come from the other things that you're eating. So try to avoid being a sweet tooth kind of person, and it probably will be helpful to your brain. Yes, your brain needs energy, but if you eat the right kind of food, it's getting the proper energy from the right kind of food and not an overabundance of the white sugar.
Okay. And Joe, is this your question? What are the 7 senses?
Yeah, I think I said 7. There are only 5. What am I thinking of? Yeah, I did say 7. Now that you mentioned it. Yeah, right. Sorry about that. There are only 5.
No, there's 5 that you know about, Joe. But at William & Mary, they offer 2 additional senses.
We'll give you an advanced degree for the other 2 senses.
Whoa.
Okay.
Well.
Sorry about that. So I was driving you crazy all through the talk. What's he talking about? Right? Yeah. Oh my goodness.
And I have a question.
Yes.
Have you ever done a study to determine the impact that daily intentional prayer has on brain health?
Studies have been done on some members of religious sects in monasteries and so on, where prayer is an important daily activity. And the brains of those individuals the plastic brain is built a little bit different. I used you as an analogy with the music part of your brain. The praying part of your brain, communicating to a higher being, seems to trigger some growth in other areas of the brain. And it seems to be very helpful in the sense of de-stressing and all the bad things that I've talked about here that can lead to demented states. So prayer is very good. What else can I say? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, we all have those senior moments, I know. You're asking a really hard and very important question, because the earlier we can detect a true decline into dementia, the better the likelihood is we can treat it and stop it and prevent it from going farther, or keep it at bay longer so you have an extended lucent period for your life before you really start falling apart. The problem is we haven't really been able to come up with good markers that indicate dementia, because the behaviors you're talking about can just be senior moments, but if they continue to happen, pay attention to what Janet is telling you. I'm trying to pay attention to what April is telling me. If it seems like you're turning into a different person, you should probably get checked in some fashion. Now, I've recently had a couple of MRIs of my brain for other reasons, but it's interesting. My neurologist in town, Dr. Patrick Harding, was also one of my students, Doc. So, just like your wife, Janet, was one of my students. So, I've been in education long enough that some of my students have retired, and I'm still teaching. I'm finishing up my 51st year at William & Mary. When I say we, I'm talking about the research community. We're really trying to find a convenient marker that would indicate dementia. There are some interesting things like the peanut butter sniff test. If you can't detect the smell of peanut butter, it could be an indication of something wrong with your brain. But that kind of goes back to COVID here. Remember, COVID, a lot of people lost the sense of taste and smell. Those are 2 of the 5 senses, okay? I'm working on the others that take us up to 7, but to taste and smell. One of the things that I found interesting is a very recent research article that suggests that ophthalmologists, when they do a eye dilation and then look at your retina, that there are early indicators in the blood vessel structure in your retina that can indicate the start of dementia in your brain. So at my last eye checkup, I quizzed my ophthalmologist. I said, "Do you know about this research? How does my retina look?" And he said, "No, I'm not up on that," because it was very recent research. I was just picking on him because So what we're looking for ultimately is a blood test. I mean, we periodically get blood work, so if we could have a blood marker that would say maybe you should do something, or this ophthalmology thing looking at a retina would be a nice way to go, because we get periodic eye exams. What you don't want to have to do is take a spinal tap and draw some cerebral spinal fluid and then analyze that. That's really a nasty way to look at something. And the MRI, as I mentioned, gives you some structural information, but it doesn't give you functional information. The PET scan gives you functional information, but not many people are going to be getting PET scans. Insurance companies don't cover them except for very special reasons. So that's a problem. So I'm beating around the bushes here, Michael, because there is no one answer that I can say, here's what we ought to do. It's a matter of observing your behavior and keeping track of what's going on, and having those loved ones close to you who know your personality. If they're seeing some changes, maybe encouraging you to go to the doctor to see what can be found. And that's where we are. We'd love to have an early marker to begin treatment, because there are some treatments. There are no cures, but there are some treatments that can hold things at bay.
Are there any other questions? Anything that comes in from people who are watching? Okay. Well, this is the second time, and I didn't even recognize the first part of the lecture because I don't remember you saying those things. I didn't process that. That was kind of troubling to me that I didn't process it. That's exactly right. But I really
Well,
appreciate your time. I can't even express to you how much we
Oh.
appreciate you
no,
being
thank
here.
you, thank you. And
And
I'm just going to return those feelings because this has been real special for me being able to come out for this particular church for the reasons that I mentioned. So, I love you guys because you're supporting the community in the way you are doing with the outreach with music to the places like the consulate and other facilities. It's just wonderful to see that happening.
And I told you, had this curriculum been available and had I not been afraid that we were married that I would have failed it, I would have taken it. And had I taken it, then I would have majored in it, and it would have changed the whole course of my life. I wouldn't be preaching here at the Wellspring now. I'd be a scientist, doing research somewhere, and you and I would receive rewards together. So that would be one.
There you go.
Anyway,
Yeah.
So if you need an assistant, is what I'm saying. If you so, I thank you very much for coming and being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want
Thank
to
you.
express my gratitude to all of you too, and I hope that you heard things you didn't know, learned some things, motivated things for your own brain health and for understanding people that you have to deal with who have these cognitive issues. But thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.